statement.
Oh, got it, thanks.
And I'll give you one just in case.
Just in case I like
Just in case you decide to. I brought it up here, but then you walked in.
That's very, you know.
So whatever you have.
She is.
Here, this is like your
She
old one.
keels over and there, I don't even stop. I
Is
just
it?
take
Yeah,
it up.
I'm gonna take that away from you.
Changed again?
Yes, we did. Well, I think you're gonna change it again too.
Let's see.
I only told people 3 minutes for the individual, but my understanding is you're gonna change it again.
I might.
Okay.
It just depends on what they ask for in the card.
Well, we've told people 3 minutes as they come up.
Depends on how many they have.
Yeah, but I mean, that's the standard what they.
No, I know. We were talking about it yesterday, though,
Yeah,
that
like
they
I
were
know.
talking. No, but also if
John
they're
had this funny
representing
thing.
somebody, John said to give them more time.
Yeah, except that when John said give him more time, he said, you know, like if they're 4, give him 2
Oh, yeah, that
minutes.
was really fun. Hi.
Good morning.
How are you?
I'm fine. How are you doing?
I'm good.
So you probably got the message
So
of
give him
Michael's
some
picture.
remedial math.
Yes.
I'm your Michael for the day.
Oh, yeah. We have to ask him really tough questions. If Michael's not
Charlie used to
here.
enjoy it.
Oh, that's right, yeah.
Anyway, any questions? Just to hearing lots of people talking. Feel free to ask questions.
Not that many people.
Well,
Okay.
you know, yeah. I actually, I didn't put a wager on this one, like I did the ag order,
I think that.
but my guess was 4 hours. I might be way overshooting.
I was gonna say 3, but maybe.
I don't know. I told somebody it might go late. I just don't know until we see how many cards we have.
Yeah. Oh, but who is vulnerable?
Billy?
I don't know. He's on the.
He's right there. African glasses in the middle right.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Did you just get a new
He's just been appointed to the DWP commission.
Oh, really?
Let me introduce you.
Good. Yeah, that's it. And you should meet him too. He's an attorney.
I've seen his comments.
Yeah.
Sure. Oh, yeah, I read
I just wanted to introduce you to Fran. We were talking about you
Hi.
last night, and she has been following DWP more closely in this last
Yes.
decade than I. So
Congratulations.
You guys should get
And
together.
do you know Phil?
Phil Wiles.
He's our attorney. I want to give you a heads up. I suggested that you should, because of your new position, should go to the environmental law gathering in
Oh, in
October.
Yosemite.
In Yosemite? Do
Right.
you ever do that?
Oh yeah, I used to go all the time. Then I got really active in LACPA environmental. People migrate between,
Oh, the
state.
two.
Oh,
EPA,
okay,
and
okay.
So yeah.
Anyway, but it might be a good time to do it because both Cliff and Kim go and are real active.
Right. No, that'd be great. I met you via Adon Ortega.
Oh,
Introduced
okay,
me.
right.
Tom Soto introduced me to you.
He's a good friend of
yeah,
Soto's.
Yeah,
And
good.
Maureen Kendall. I saw
Oh, good.
many more Maureen events
Right,
at California Club.
right.
Yeah, no, so Tom's a pal.
Yeah.
Uncle Tom is what my daughter calls him.
Oh my God, that's funny.
Yeah.
So, okay. So we'll see how long this lasts.
Yeah. No, may not last.
I
I
can't
don't think-
tell how
yeah,
many
I
of these
think-
people are going to talk. It's hard to know.
Yeah.
I'm not really sure where our other two board members are.
Well, yeah, we can't start till one of them. that
Yeah,
shows
we
up.
need at least one.
So when's your first meeting?
I'm not confirmed yet, so he,
So it's after you
Yeah,
get.
yeah.
Do you have to
but-
be confirmed before you can start?
the city council.
Oh,
has,
You do?
Yeah.
Interesting.
I forgot.
I do too.
Herb's a friend, so.
Because we don't have to. We don't affect that.
Yeah, no, it's, so, but the big thing is the union contract right
Oh,
here.
yeah, I know. I've been reading about it.
Yeah. You think you'll get confirmed after
I
they
think
figure
he
out what to
wants
do?
us to get on as quickly as possible to hold the party. Well, I do.
Yeah.
Do
right.
you know Brian Darcy yet?
I don't.
Yeah, that would be. He's
Very-
not
very
evil, the
effective.
evil villain, but he's a fascinating character.
Even his opponents say he's just the most incredible and effective human leader.
Yeah, no, and he has a lot of energy, and he's been there a long time.
Yeah. Most people say I wouldn't do anything different than he did if I were in his shoes.
Right. No, right.
He's not like that.
Well, good luck.
I look
And
forward.
I live in Redondo Beach, so
Oh, you do? I used
yes.
to live in El Segundo.
Oh,
Close to
okay.
Hancock Park now, and a lot of goes to Marlboro. So.
Oh, nice.
Good. Well, I'm there. I'm usually
You
up
have to do
here.
this to pay for it.
Yeah, that's right. Exactly.
I usually am down there at the end of most weeks and every weekend. So So, anyway, we'll see each other.
Okay.
Great.
Do we know where
Thank
Dee Dee is? Oh, I haven't.
Dee Dee?
No, that's okay. As once we get 3, we can start. Oh, happy
I
birthday!
love that. I think that's so good. John, are you going to mimic?
Good morning.
I'm not going to ask Phil. As counselor, he has to speak first.
Courtney,
Have you
can you
done it?
turn this on? Good morning. Is that on? Good morning. We'll get started in just a few moments. We do need a third board member. We anticipate having 4. There's a little bit of traffic delay there. Okay, no problem.
Yes. Oh, wait,
I
today?
just saw the text. Yeah.
Oh,
We don't have to sing to him, but
I think we should.
that'd just be a bit much.
Yeah, that's right. It might show prejudice.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. That was good. I remember his face, but I just didn't remember. I didn't have the name attached or the connection.
Yeah.
That's interesting. They have to wait.
Yeah, I forgot that.
Oh, Ken said that Fuhrer is very interested in getting involved with Did you get Tom's email?
He told me about it. I talked, but I didn't have a chance to look. As I came in, I talked to him about it. He
Doesn't
said
sound good.
he would talk to Ken. Oh my gosh.
What?
They're appointing Dave Orthen and Don Ortega to the Water Commission today.
Okay.
Confidential, so keep it quiet. I'm ambivalent about it, Don.
Oh, he's generally okay. But you should be ambivalent.
Huh?
Ambivalent is good. But he's okay. He gets it on a tear ever so often. Defensive. How the big environmental guys around him get. Only 12 cards so far.
What is our leverage on Ken? Well, there should be some.
Not much. Now he's here.
Sorry,
Here we are.
We can, well,
I mean, it's, yeah, I think it's going to be a fine sit down. Yeah, John. Saying,
That would be a challenge.
Will they ever finish painting that thing? Oh, you don't park here.
Okay, so
The one you like.
You're here, ready to go? I think should we start? I think we should start. Okay.
and should you, I mean, just in case you drop over during your presentations.
Oh, yeah, that's right. Are you ready?
We just want to get that out of the way.
We are so prepared.
Here she is.
I hear a door. Good. Perfect timing. Good morning. Good morning, everybody. Today is Wednesday, August 21st at 9:10 on that clock.
They can't hear you.
Oh, because I turned it off. I'm not demonstrating good microphone behavior. Okay. All right. All right. Today's Wednesday, August 21st, 2013 at 9:10 on that clock, and I'm calling this meeting to order. I want to begin by introducing our board members and staff. With me today are my fellow board members. To my far left is Board Member Dee Dee Adamo. To my immediate left is Vice Chair Francis Spivey Weber, and to my right is Board Member Tam Dodak. Mr. Howard, will you please introduce the staff?
Yes, assisting the board are Courtney Davis and Janine Townsend. To my right, John Bishop, Chief Deputy, and to my left, Phil Wiles, Deputy Chief Counsel. Michael is on jury duty.
We'll want an update on whether he ends up getting on a jury by the end of this meeting, if you don't mind. I think it's always good for lawyers to get on jury duty, so I'm hoping he gets it, but for a very, very short trial. All right, emergency evacuation procedures. Most of you know if you hear a noise that sounds like an emergency sound, pick up your stuff, go. Try and be careful. Take your friends, take your stuff. Look for the exits. There are a bunch of them. And we tend to meet we're supposed to meet in Cesar Chavez Park. I suggest you do that if you want to know when we can come back. If you're done or you don't care, obviously go wherever you want. There's plenty of coffee and other stuff around. It's Wednesday. There's a good farmer's market. Won't be so terrible. Just hoping there's not a real emergency. Meeting is being webcast and recorded, so don't follow my lead. Try to speak into the microphone, make sure it's on. It's hard to do. You have to pretend you're a rock star and get really close to it, which is a little awkward if you're not Mick Jagger, but give it a whirl. And then finally, please put all of your cell phones on stun or turn them off so as not to interrupt the proceedings. That'd be helpful. Okay, so today we're having a public hearing on the proposed draft general permit for discharges of stormwater associated with industrial activity. Once adopted, this general permit will replace the current industrial general permit, Order 97-03-DWQ, upon its effective date of January 1st, 2015. State Water Board staff has been addressing critical regulatory issues pertaining to industrial stormwater since 2003, 2004, 2011, and 2012. I'm not sure what that means, but keep at it. I'm just thinking back to sort of grade school since. Whatever. Okay, sorry. The order this morning, we'll first have a presentation from Greg Gearhart, Senior Water Resource Control Engineer supervising the Industrial and Construction Discharges Unit at the State Water Board, who will provide a presentation summarizing the proposed requirements of the final draft industrial general permit. Following the staff presentation will be two 20-minute block presentations. There's some confusion whether it was 20 or 30. I'd appreciate if you try to be closer to 20, since I thought it was 30 yesterday and told someone that. The first will be a presentation from non-governmental organizations representing the regulated entities and industrial interests, and the second will be a 20-minute block presentation by the non-governmental organizations representing environmental interests. Following these two block presentations will be individual public comments. Individual speakers will be limited to 3 minutes to ensure everyone who's interested in talking get a chance to speak. Generally, you can make your point in 3 minutes for us, and you'll be submitting written comments later. On the speaker card, you'll note if you want more time, you can ask for it, but you're going to have to give me a good reason, like you're representing a lot of people, or it's got to be really creative or particularly amusing, and then I might give you a little more time. But generally, the most important thing, if you've been in all these meetings many times, in 3 minutes you can tell us the most important things we should be looking for in your comments and what to be aware of, and it actually is more effective than a long presentation. So please fill out a blue speaker card in the back and hand it to the clerk of the board in the front of the room, and then individuals will be called in the order that they're received. Mr. Gerhardt, take it away.
Thank you. Good morning, Chair Marcus and members of the board. My name is Greg Gerhardt, Senior Engineer in the Division of Water Quality. I'm going to start with a high-level overview of the changes to this final draft of the general permit. And then if there's any follow-up questions or need to go into more detail, my very accomplished staff will take over at that point. So let me introduce actually the team. To my right is my supervisor, Diana Messina, who's now in charge of the surface water regulatory section. And then to her right is Laurel Wardrop, environmental scientist. To my left is Reagan Moray, engineer. And then to his left is Leo Cosentini, engineer and lead staff on the permit. Rusty Hansen has also helped out, and he's in my unit. He's not on the panel right now. So I want to remind everyone that they should stand at the podium when they talk.
Mr. Gerhardt is now demonstrating how to stand at the podium.
It's a lot easier to change the slides this way. Bear with me, getting my orientation here.
The wheel.
Hang on. There.
The wheel.
All right.
Got it? Good.
I think I got it. Okay, so I want to remind everyone that the goals for this adoption and this reissuance of the permit are to improve the performance overall of the program and to also improve our ability to measure that performance. So that has to do with the quality of the data that we're getting back, as well as we wanted to provide some incentives and flexibility to drive the dischargers and the whole program towards the types of performance we expect. And then most importantly, in the last few rounds, we've been trying to ensure that the costs that we're implying through the permit are appropriate and reduced to the extent that's appropriate. Thought I had it. Which button, just so I know?
No,
It's the wheel, that's what I thought.
Do you think,
Rolling.
can we get a new mouse for this?
The gyration mouse. Okay,
We're
next
going to
slide,
do an
please.
X Prize for
Cool.
the best new.
I can do this
mouse.
any old way. So I'm going to run through the timeline. This is a horrible slide in some regards, but the timeline shows that the first iteration of this general permit was in 1991. It was reissued in 1997. That's the current permit. In 2003, the board started a reissuance process and held some hearings and had comments and 2 drafts in that era. And at that point, it was suspended because of an interest in resolving the questions about the role of numerics in stormwater permits as a whole, and in particular this permit. And so a blue ribbon panel of experts was convened to address the questions about the role of numeric measures, so to speak, in stormwater permits. And at that point, after they produced a report, they made a bunch of recommendations about the whole program, municipal, construction, and industrial. The State Water Board directed staff to work on the construction permit first in 2009. That was adopted with the inclusion of electronic reporting and the SMARTS database, and then we started working on the industrial permit again, took it off the shelf, so to speak, and started working on it again. And now we're on the 3rd draft of this latest effort to reissue, and it's what we're calling the final draft, or the 2013 draft. Next slide, please. I'm going to run through the significant changes in the permit. Next slide, please. And this is in comparison to the last draft, so it's not in comparison to the significant changes of the current version, 97. So the last draft is the reference point. In particular, the receiving water, this clarifies that a duly authorized representative is the person that we're going to refer to. It's not a significant thing in many regards, but it's really about who's responsible, and it relates to the electronic reporting requirements. So this is a change, but we're still talking about owners and operators being available to sign up. This is about who gets to do it electronically and sign the form electronically. Next slide, please. We added language to address the trade secret issues. We had a lot in there already regarding what was considered homeland security or other kinds of secure information and whether it was required to be submitted. We did not speak directly about confidential business information or trade secrets, and so now we have information in there on that. And the details of that we can work through later. Next slide, please. Minimum BMPs have been revised, and we added advanced BMPs. This is consistent with the United States Environmental Protection Agency's multi-sector general permit. I'll call it MSGP, but it's the US EPA's permit that covers discharges of the same type of industrial activity throughout the United States where there are no other NPDES permits. So it's about 8 states or so and a bunch of tribes and reservations and other lands like that, territories. Next slide, please. We made some changes regarding the total maximum daily load requirements. So as consistent with the last, we're still not fully addressing or including implementation requirements for total maximum daily loads that are approved today, because they all require some translation, and we think it's appropriate to do that translation with the regional boards and the stakeholders' involvement, since it was unlikely they were involved in the adoption process. So now we're just clarifying some of those statements and requirements in the permit, and we were asked to specifically go through some TMDLs, and we did that, and we again arrived at the position that all of them require some translation, and so none of those TMDLs are being implemented upon adoption the way it's written today. And there's a period of time, it's not real clear actually in the permit whether it's 2 years, but I think staff's expectation was that it would take a couple years to work with the stakeholders, the regional boards, and the what have you interest to get it back to the State Water Board to reopen the permit and then put these new requirements in.
So there's not a time certain in there?
Well,
that concerns me given the 2003, 2006, 2008.
I looked for it recently. We've been saying 2 years, but in one of the recent workshops we looked for it, and it's not clear whether it reopens. Part of the challenge, I think, is the wording was aimed at directing the regional boards and the state board staff to do something, and this permit doesn't regulate state board and regional board staff. And so I think there's a finding that it states our expectation, but I don't know if there's a time certain reopener on 2 years. If there's not, that was staff's interest and intent, but I don't know if it just fell out or what have you.
So we will clarify that before
Well,
adoption, because it is our expectation that we will bring this back by a date certain to the board for consideration.
All right. I'm guessing we'll hear about that this morning.
Next slide, please. The ocean plan has recently been amended, and the process of that amendment is working its way through the Office of Administrative Law. When it becomes final, there's a requirement that certain types of industrial facilities do additional monitoring. This was another section that was difficult for us to do sitting in our central headquarters office here, anticipating what exact facilities would be subject to this requirement, what types of outfalls and what kind of appropriate monitoring would be required. And given that the timeline for the adoption is about 16 months from today to take effect for the permit, we thought it would be best to use this permit as a lever to hopefully drive the regional boards to issue appropriate requirements consistent with the ocean plan, since they're probably the most appropriate staff and the boards to be doing that work anyway. So we didn't include it in this permit, but it's not because we're ignoring it, it's because we're trying to use this permit to drive more effective and more efficient requirements in place. Next slide, please. The practitioner, the expectations for what a person has to do have changed slightly. We still have in this permit the role of a qualified industrial stormwater practitioner, QISP. There's only one type though, we simplified it. One of the main, I should have pointed out, one of the main tools we used when we reviewed the 2012 comments and preparing the final draft was to make it more simple and to make it more appropriate for the types of requirements and discharger community that was working on it. So we listened again to the comments and we really tried to make it not as complicated as it had been. So this is one of the things that was simplified. Instead of 3 levels of training, there's now 1. And the required role is only taking effect when a facility goes out of baseline status. And what that means is if they have an exceedance. So if they don't have an exceedance of any of the numbers in the draft permit, then they won't have to hire this person or have one of their staff trained to become one of these people, because we'll assume that they're meeting the requirements and of the permit anyway. So the role of the training will only kick in when you go into level 1. The other exception is, I'm sorry, that the QISP is also required for a group leader. So the other issue with training is that, and we've dealt with this somewhat in the construction general permit too, since we adopted the training requirements for the 2009 construction general permit, we've been hearing from a certain group that represents engineering companies throughout the nation, in particular California. This engineering group tried legislating twice to have themselves accepted from these types of training requirements, not only in the Water Board, but throughout the other state agencies, with the idea that two state agencies, the Board of Professional Engineers, Land Surveyors, and Geologists, and the Board of X or whoever department shouldn't be both regulating this group of professionals with similar and maybe overlapping requirements. So in light of that, we're anticipating we'll hear from them on this permit as well. So we're expecting to handle them the way that we're doing with the construction general permit, which is we make non-licensed professionals go through a training that has a certificate program and an exam, and then we let the licensees self-train, and they would also certify that they've taken the training. And there would probably also be similar or analogous exam requirements. So the difference really has to do with cost. It wasn't that the licensees think they know everything and wanted to bypass the training. It was more about the cost concerns and the regulatory concerns. Okay, next slide, please. Visual monitoring, this is something that has often been referred to as inspections. What we have done is tried to clarify and simplify again what are the expectations. So we condensed some of the visual observation requirements into what we thought would be regular events that occur. So for example, the monthly visual observation now includes what was going to be a quarterly requirement to walk around and look at authorized and non-authorized non-stormwater discharges. These would be things like air conditioning, condensate, and things that were not stormwater related, but that might be dripping and discharging. And so instead of having a monthly and a quarterly, we've combined them into the monthly requirement so that when they walk around once a month, they're looking for all these things. Similar with the pre-storm the pre-storm observations are not required anymore. That was too hard to specify. It seems easy to say it's going to rain, but it became very difficult to put that in certainty so that it was enforceable. And then the stormwater visual observations of actual discharges occurring at the outfalls, we've decided to combine that with their sampling events so that when they're actually walking around sampling those outfalls, they would also observe the discharges. So there wouldn't have to be a dual requirement there. Next slide, please. The sampling frequency has changed from quarterly to twice in the first half of the year. The bottom line is this is still aiming at trying to get 4 samples on average. Most facilities are going to have to do this 4 per year approach. But what we did is instead of making it 1 per quarter, we made it 2 per half year. And we think this will significantly increase the chance of getting 4 per facility per year. And that's because once you increase it to 6 months, you have a better likelihood of getting 2 qualifying storm events. That also helps for planning purposes. It's another one of those complexities that was relatively easy to take out, and it worked in our interest. Next slide, please. We've defined or revised the definition of qualifying storm event, so a rain gauge is no longer required. And the dry weather interval has decreased from 72 to 48 hours. And again, this is based on comments, but also on the interest to increase the number of actual qualifying storm events so that we can have hopefully a closer number to 4 events per facility per year. So when they had 72, when they had an option to wait longer, obviously you could have a lot of questionable events that maybe it was really the same storm event, it wasn't a new storm event. So decreasing that time makes it more likely that it's a different storm event, and therefore they would have to sample. Next slide, please. The pH average was removed. It's awkward. We'll probably do that in the construction general permit too. There's still an instantaneous maximum for pH though. And then the option was added for facilities to use a screening method. One of the issues with pH is that it has a 15-minute holding time, so you either have to buy a device that's calibrated and maintained and compliant with EPA requirements, or you have to get it to a lab within 15 minutes to do the analysis. Some facilities, that's actually maybe their lab is on site, some of these very large, odd facilities. But for most people, that was going to mean you had to buy the equipment and calibrate it and maintain it and train people to operate it correctly. The staff interest was to get good values on pH and to have some sort of meaningful requirement so that they could adjust their BMPs if they had a problem with pH. And so we make the recommendation that they are allowed to use a screening method, and if they exceed that twice, then they would have to go to the other method and buy the device. Next slide, please. Representative sampling reduction replaces sample location reduction. It's kind of analogous, and we're still trying to improve the language on that by having some discussions with stakeholders. But the other thing is that the justification required is now required in the monitoring implementation plan. The monitoring implementation plan is something that is submitted along with the stormwater pollution prevention plan and adjusted as needed. So what this sampling reduction means is if they have similar best management practices, similar industrial activities in 2 drainage areas, they could reduce the number of and let's say each one of these areas, drainage areas, had maybe 5 different places that the discharge was occurring on them. They could then say, well, all these areas are the same. We'll take a representative reduced sample number of locations from it. Next slide, please. Similarly, there's the ability to combine samples. So if you have locations that have, again, this analogous BMPs and analogous or identical industrial activity, then you can combine your samples, and it's done at the lab. It doesn't necessarily reduce the number of samples. In the 97 permit, we allowed them to just simply not sample those areas, but now they'll have to sample, again, for example, maybe all 10 of those outfalls, and then at the lab they could be combined into one for a reduced cost. Sample frequency reduction has been the trigger to meet the requirement to reduce has been reduced from 8 to 4, and that's to be consistent with EPA. We had the idea that in the last draft that you had to sample 8 consecutive events to show that your discharges were analogous and that you weren't changing, you weren't having any exceedances. And so you were able to do that with 8. Now it's been reduced to 4 to be consistent with EPA. The frequency reduction is 2 samples per year also. So even if you achieve this and you've demonstrated with 4 samples that you don't have to sample every location all the time, you still have to sample twice per year. It doesn't get you out of sampling completely. Next slide, please. Exceedance response actions. This is the do loop, so to speak, of the permit. So when an exceedance occurs of one of these numeric action levels, whether it's instantaneous or an annual, you start having to do more at your facility. And the first level is considered where you're looking at operational BMPs, and the second is where you're looking at more structural and treatment control and expensive fixes. So the ERA as an introduction, that's it. Some of the changes that we've done, the numeric action levels are applicable on the permit date. In the previous draft, we had them phase in after a year. We decided to try to condense our interests with the timing so that we have a year to get the permit into effect, meaning we can build the database and get all the mechanisms and staff trained, and so can the dischargers. And then when it takes effect completely. So there's not another year of phase in or another few months or whatever. So that was the change in the interest. So we added a little time to what we thought would be needed for us to implement it, and we took out the phase in. So changes in status, if a facility goes from baseline to level 1 or level 1 to level 2, these would take effect on July 1st of each year. That's a change. And then level 1 ERA report, the date has been extended to January 1st, so that's about 6 months after they would go into that level. So they'd have 6 months to evaluate their operational BMPs and then provide a report back. So the general idea is that most of the status changes are on July 1, and most of the reporting required on that would be, on the plans would be required on the 6-month or maybe the 12-month after that, or 18-month. Next slide, please. We added a level 2 ERA action plan, and that is essentially to allow us to understand what they're going to do before they start working on their structural and treatment controls. Instead, we had it where they tell us after the fact what they did. So this is just a new thing that we wanted to make sure that we had an option to look at what their plans were. So that's due January 1st, again, 6 months after they would get into that status. Level 2 ERA technical report is now due on January 1st of that next year. So they would have 6 months to write a plan and then another year to do the work under the current requirements. The level 2 ERA demonstrations have now been combined. This is another effort to simplify. So we had, once a facility got into level 2, there were lots of different options. They could be doing different demonstration reports, and then they'd have to turn in their other report, and then they could have this going on for multiple pollutants. What we tried to do is combine it into one so that there's a requirement to report back, and it could include chapters on demonstrations and what have you. Next slide, please. One of the demonstration options, it used to be called the BCT compliance demonstration. It's now referred to as the Industrial Activity Best Management Practices Technical Report. And so this is, it's actually a demonstration within that technical report, and it replaces the language that was problematic because it implied that the facilities were able to self-regulate. So we changed the term on that. We also changed some of the language and the requirements about that. The discharger can submit the level 2 ERA plans at any time now, meaning if they're the permit takes effect on January 1, 2015 as written. If they're knowing on January 1 that they're going to have a problem with a certain pollutant, they can start working on that and submit that information as soon as possible. They wouldn't necessarily get the relief until they went through level 1 though. Staff's interest is to still have these facilities go through that review of operational BMPs because there might be something that they catch and it's relatively low cost. Next slide, please. Next slide, sorry. Dischargers eligible for baseline after they are in level 2. They're eligible after they have submitted their industrial activity BMP technical report and they have sampled from 4 consecutive quarters. I think this would now be, it wouldn't be quarters necessarily. It would be, 4 consecutive samples that don't exceed the action level that got them there. So the easy way to remember this is the only way to get back to baseline once you're in level 2. And remember, baseline is not a compliance problem. It's a bit of a tag that they would wear around saying we have an exceedance and we've been in level 2 for pollutant X. But the only way to get out of that now is to stop exceeding and to have submitted the correct reports. There's a lot of interest, I think, to have people, when they say, they throw their hands up, we've done all we can, or it's not our problem because it's not industrial, they would like to get out of level 2 status. Our interest is to only have that occur when they've met these 2 requirements. Next slide, please. The BMP implementation extension request has been replaced by a new thing that's somewhat similar. It's the ability for the discharger to say, I need a little more time to implement these BMPs because I'm in level 2. I have to go shop around. I have to size different options. I'm going to actually maybe do some pilot testing of things, whatever. The old way was they would make the request and they would be subject to regional board review to either grant the request or not. The new way, they just get it automatically. They get 6 months if they ask for it. And that way we don't become a roadblock in their ability to evaluate this. If they wanted more time, they would have to ask the regional board. But the term was changed, and then also the mechanism of whether we were in the way of reviewing it or not has changed. And that's largely due to its regional board and other input. Even the dischargers, I think, don't want to have to wait a few weeks for a regional board staff to tell them that they have some more time. Next slide, please. Compliance groups and compliance group leaders. This is a long-running topic that has been around since at least the 97 permit as group monitoring. Now what the interest is to have, from a staff perspective, have more and more facilities participate in these if possible, because one of the things that I also failed to mention in the beginning of the presentation was a major interest was connecting the data that we're collecting in this permit through self-monitoring, connect that to the appropriate types of regulatory tools. It was expected, I think, in previous drafts that this data coming in would answer all sorts of questions about regulatory interest, program interest, receiving water impacts, BAT evaluation, you name it. And I think we were putting too much of a burden on that data. And so what we tried to do with this latest draft is, and this is consistent throughout the chain of command, we all agree that the purpose of this data is best suited to do an evaluation of whether they're exceeding their numbers or not. And that's really as simple as it is. And so the idea that the compliance groups can help with that has now become an attractive thing for staff. So we want to encourage compliance groups. So we're trying to build in some more incentives, or at least more support for the idea that a facility undergoing some leadership through a compliance group, they won't necessarily get to hide behind the group monitoring of the days of old, but they will still be able to benefit from many of the expertise and the resources available through a group. And so staff's interest is to encourage more of that. So with that in mind, we've made some changes, and one of them is that the leaders must prepare, these groups must have a qualified industrial stormwater practitioner, and the leader must prepare the report. There's also a bit of an incentive, so there's a reduction in sampling. Members in a group would only have to do 2 qualifying storm events per year. That's 1 in the 6 months of the first part and 1 in the second 6 months. And then if they had a sample reduction at their site, sample frequency reduction, they would be able to reduce that down to 1 total per year. Next slide, please. There's some other little changes that are in there. The annual reporting consists of a single checklist. The model is changing significantly. Those of us who know the permit pretty well, we know that a lot of information and resource is spent both internal at the water boards and external on the annual reporting currently in the 97. What we're trying to do is get information along the way. So as a facility is providing data about their sampling, they have a certain requirement to do it ad hoc along the way. So the annual report doesn't have to collect that. And the other thing is a lot of the evaluation information is going to be in some of these other reports. So the annual report doesn't have to necessarily require all that. And so we're trying to make the reporting match up what the staff ability and interest is to improve the program, as well as what the public and the minimum requirements are with the regulations. So that's why it's been reduced to a relatively simple checklist. The qualified industrial stormwater practitioner is not required to prepare a no exposure certification anymore. This was a change from the previous draft. We had also included that they had to, the QISP had to be the one that signed the no exposure cert and the annual recert associated with that. And we took that out. We added a special condition that addresses a particular California problem where in our water code we have an animal, so to speak, a regulatory animal called a notice of non-applicability, a NONA. And this NONA has created a bit of an issue since it was conceived in the late 90s, early 2000s. And keep in mind that's after the last permit. So since about that time, without any permit mention of it, staff and dischargers have been sort of guessing as to how to establish a no discharge facility and how to approve it. So what we're proposing is to have some criteria in this permit that clarifies that. And that would be a facility that claims they don't ever discharge. And so what we're specifically saying is that they would have to have an engineer evaluate all the existing rainfall data and make a statement and a stamp and a certification that says it would not have discharged under any of those conditions. Next slide, please. That concludes my presentation. We're obviously here all day for questions. And unless you have any right now, I'll give it up to, I think Casca goes next.
Questions? Okay, let's move on. Thanks very much.
Before we start on the comments,
Presentation.
Craig, could you update the folks here? They might not have all heard that we extended the comment period to the new date, and I don't remember off the top of my head what that was.
You're right. Thank you. Late last week, we responded to a letter from the Water Coalition requesting an additional 2 weeks. The board management agreed to that and extended the comment period to September 12th at noon. All comments are due noon on September 12th now, and this revised notice and the information is available on the website.
Hi, Mr. Brousseau.
Good morning.
Please proceed. Oh, wow, PowerPoint.
My name is Jeff Brousseau. I'm the Executive Director for the California Stormwater Quality Association, or CASQA. Good morning to you, Chair Marcus and board members. It's nice to be back talking about the industrial permit again. No, it really is actually. It's been a while. We have a little block of speakers, myself, and then two of our two committee chairs are going to speak about some of the more detailed things as well. If you can go to the next slide, please. So Catherine Wagner and Matt Lentz are the co-chairs of CASQA's Industrial Subcommittee, and they'll be providing comments as well. I'm just going to make a couple of sort of contextual remarks to give you a sense of where we're coming from and where our comments are coming from, and then they're going to get into some a little more detail on some of the key areas of the permit that we're focusing on, and just give you a sense of what to expect in our written comments, which are due by noon on September 12th. We haven't seen the response to comments yet to the previous comments, so then it's possible that that may also generate a few more areas of comment, but we're not sure yet, of course. But
when will the response to comments be available to them?
on the spot.
Staff is diligently working on that, and we hope to release them as soon as possible. I don't have a time certain. There are a lot, and we're going through them very carefully. And
But
I'll
well,
let
but
legal
well
maybe
before
weigh in
the
on the
12th.
I don't have a date that I can
Okay.
propose at this meeting right now. I think there are maybe some issues that legal or someone could explain the minimum burden and the expectation, the requirements.
I think it makes sense to at least mention the ones you might be concerned about, so you're flagging them.
Yeah,
For
yeah,
it.
and we certainly will do that. I don't know that there will be any more. I just wanted to give you a heads up in case. I didn't mean to scratch that. Okay. I understand how difficult it is to get response to comments when you get so many. Next slide, please. So Casco's Industrial Subcommittee actually is probably larger than it shows here. We probably have close to 150 people that are on the subcommittee now. Really the practitioners of the industrial permit, the people actually are trying to implement the permit. You've got, of course, a wide variety of industry types, as you can see there. You've got a number of folks who help them stay in compliance. Their attorneys, their product vendors, their consultants, and that kind of thing. We've got some municipalities, cities, and counties that are on the subcommittee as well. Excuse me, that's important because municipalities do have some facilities which are also regulated by the industrial permit as well as their own MS4 permits. And then, of course, they're often in the role of being a regulator, too, in overseeing the compliance, or at least some sense of how their local businesses are doing as well. So it's important that we get their perspective on the permit. Utilities are another significant category. Of course, they're a little different than your sort of fixed facilities. So they have some interesting interest and perspective they bring to the discussion. And then we are always interested in hearing what the academic community has to say about the permit, because stormwater quality management is a relatively young science. It's more of an art than a science still. And so we're still learning from each other about just what is the best way forward, and it's good to have the academics help us think that through as well. Next slide, please. So just to give you some sense of context there for our comments, first of all, it's important to really point out that we really appreciate staff working with us on this. It's really been helpful to have the architects talk to the practitioners and back and forth and learn from each other as to what's working and what the interests are. And there have been some significant revisions to the permit since the 2012 draft, many positive changes from our perspective as permittees. We understand, of course, that you're looking for constructive comments, and then we like the Casco way, if you will.
Destructive comments are really all that welcome. But we'll take them anyway because we're public servants. But we prefer constructive comments.
We like to be constructive, but that's sort of the Casco way, to borrow the HP way. The Casco way is to be constructive and helpful as much as we can, because we actually are the ones trying to implement the permit, and so we try to be as constructive as possible, of course, and give you comments that make the permit more cost-effective, more workable, and ultimately better at getting us to our water quality goals than maybe the current regime is. So we'll be giving you those comments as well as recommendations by the 12th as well. The permit is still quite complex. I think maybe you got some sense of that from Greg's just running through all the different bits and pieces to the permit. It's still quite complex, and it's quite stringent as well. It has been simplified, but it's still quite complex and stringent. So we think it's going to have a significant impact on industries in California, and it's going to be a significant challenge for them to implement this new permit after 15 years or so, and counting under the old or current permit from '97. So. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Catherine Wagner, who's going to talk about some of the first of our key issues, and you can go to the next.
Hi, good morning. My name is Catherine Wagner. I'm with the law firm Downey Brand. I am a co-chair with Matt Lenz of AMEC, who will speak next, of the Industrial Subcommittee of CASQA. And having worked in the area of stormwater regulation from the legal side for a couple of decades, my interest and our committee's interest is in a clear permit that people know how to implement on their site and to feel confident in compliance, motivated by all of the reasons why organizations want to be in compliance with all laws, plus the fact that this has been a very controversial permit in the past and has engendered a lot of litigation, much of it in the form of NGO citizen suits. But that is, the purpose is not to eliminate particular kinds of enforcement. The purpose is so people know what it is that they need to do to comply with the permit, and hopefully then enforcement becomes moot, except where people are not paying attention and doing the right thing. So the key issues that we're going to touch on, and this will not be too lengthy, is numeric action limits, the permit registration documents, and the implementation timeline, reporting, annual reporting in particular, a little on TMDLs and the new discharger language there, minimum versus advanced, and then we're going to have Matt Lenz give the technical comments on minimum and advanced BMPs, design storm, instantaneous NALs, some details on how the exceedance response action process works, a few comments on the monitoring program, and on LID. Next slide, please. This is a bit of a review. We've had multiple hearings on this in the past, but we have many changes in board members and in everyone, actually, in the public. The important framework that the stormwater permit is issued in is one in which there is a general permit that has to cover 50 or more kinds of industries and every possible sort of physical setting. And it's important to keep in mind that you can comply with the Clean Water Act in issuing the permit by defining a process that people can follow and use to select and evaluate their practices and their facilities at the site. And this process can satisfy both what are called technology-based and water quality-based effluent limit requirements as a matter of legal fact. So then when you set out the measures in this process, those should clearly constitute compliance and should satisfy both technology-based and water quality-based limit requirements. And we still have in this draft permit some disconnect between the statement in Section 5 about what the technology-based effluent limit is, which is also reflected in footnote 1 in XH1 of the minimum BMPs. We would certainly like to see it tied to the process that's described for selection of BMPs and the SWIP and all the requirements of the permit to show that that's how you're satisfying technology-based effluent limit requirements of the Clean Water Act. Specifically, there's a footnote 1 in the minimum BMPs that is the same wording as in the technology-based limit, and that is BMPs that reduce or prevent discharge of pollutants in a manner that reflects best industry practice considering technological availability and economic achievability. In the past drafts, we had statements comply with BAT-BCT, and we are extremely happy that they have, this draft removes those kinds of statements. And this is an attempt to translate, I believe, the BAT-BCT standards into something narrative, which is much appreciated. We would ask that you look at the EPA language that mentions practicability and consider using language of economic practicability and achievability because this appears to be language which only refers to best available technology. Many pollutants people are controlling are not toxic pollutants and shouldn't be subject to that. But again, if you can tie the process to the limits, that would also be very helpful. Next slide, please. This is a brief review about numeric action levels, which will be well known to many of you. The numeric action levels in the permit are not effluent limits. They're not, the concept of an action level is not defined in Clean Water Acts or regulations. What it is part of the process. If you exceed an action level, then you take specific steps outlined in the exceedance response action sections of the permit. And exceeding the action level in itself is not a permit violation. We have been concerned in the past that the responses to action level exceedances would become virtual effluent limits, and we very much appreciate that this comment was taken seriously and that this permit makes a very good attempt to prevent that from happening by defining what people had to do and to some extent when they can file a technical report and say, okay, we've done everything we need to do, even if we're still exceeding that action level, because those action levels are not effluent limits and they didn't go through the process necessary to adopt as effluent limits. So we're very pleased that we've made a lot of progress in that regard. And as we've said before, our position was that if the EPA benchmarks are to be used, then they should be consistent with how they're used in the multi-sector general permit and EPA's permit, which is where they come from, that applies in states that don't run their own program, and which would be an evaluation tool and evaluating your BMPs at the site. And that process, again, would constitute compliance. Next slide. Receiving water limits, we had a comment last time that we'll retain the comments on the receiving water limits that I don't believe have changed. The receiving water limits should again refer back to the process as being the primary way the receiving water limits are being satisfied, including a presumption that they'll be satisfied even if you may have to adopt more BMPs than BAT, BCT, or than the practicable, feasible level that satisfies your SWIP requirements. And then the phrase cause or contribute to is something that people continue to have trouble interpreting. And after some research, we found there is no basis for saying or contribute and cause or contribute, although we do understand the state uses that term. Next slide. CASQA concurs with the general approach for incorporating TMDLs. We understand and completely agree that the staff does not have much choice in how to do this because the TMDLs are not capable of being properly translated into effluent limits or into the permit requirements yet. And CASQA will certainly alert its members and participate and cooperate in the subsequent steps the board will take. Even though it sounds like it's all going to be a lot of work, that's how it is. And we'll put in some written comments to ask for additional clarification about new dischargers that talk about if you're a new discharger discharging to impaired water bodies, you can't discharge the pollutant, or you have to show that you don't have that pollutant on site, or you have to show that you meet that number end of pipe. It's a very stringent provision, and we want to make sure it's crystal clear and that it matches the requirements in the federal regs and doesn't go further, because this could impede business in California if it's not understood. Certainly also good to reduce the number of questions that you get. Next slide. And the effective date is much appreciated that it is long enough that we think the training programs and the SMARTS functions should be up and running by that time, which was really, really important. We were very concerned that people might have to start complying and then not be able to get everything done because the training and the SMARTS wasn't up and running. Obviously, we'd like you to also make sure, and that staff make sure that really is the case, that SMARTS really is up and running. We do have some comments, and I understand others will comment on the effective date being in the sort of middle in January, because that's the middle of a storm season, and many people have to train their people for a storm season, and to, at Christmas time, tell people, okay, now you're changing permits and here's what you have to do, is going to be difficult, as well as having to file potentially 2 reports. Next slide. There's an overall continuing concern about having to file your entire SWIP electronically, and we recommend that you stay consistent with the MSGP, having it available for review. Some people are more comfortable with the hard copy submission and not electronic, but there are still remaining concerns that there's so much detail on a very good SWIP and map that it is it really has security risks beyond, you know, the Homeland Security Act and proprietary concerns that are, you know, it's hard to identify everything about how your layout is and where your employees are working and everything as Homeland Security issue, or redact everything and say it's a trade secret and then have to get into the question of what it is. So we feel, and are going to put in some specific comments about how general information could be provided that gives you more than the last NOI, but not requiring filing of the new SWIP. And I just also comment that if people have to update their SWIP or their QUISP filing, we need to know how often they have to do that, and perhaps have a minimum period, so you don't have to file changes right away. Next slide. I think I'm done. Yes, thank you very much. I'll turn it over to Matt Lenz.
Thank you, Catherine. I'll finish up the last few minutes here. Thank you, Chair Marcus and members of the board. My name's Matt Lentz. I'm a senior associate with AMEC, and Catherine's co-chair, as you've heard several times, for the industrial subcommittee. Like I said, I'm going to spend the last few minutes just touching on a few other items of interest to CASQA and to the industrial subcommittee. First is the need to clarify the relationship between minimum BMPs identified in this draft permit and a new section called advanced BMPs. Really what we recommend the language in the permit just be made clear that these advanced BMPs are to be evaluated and implemented if the minimum BMPs are insufficient when you go through that process and not necessarily required at the onset of the permit. We believe this was probably the board's intent, and it seems to be in the fact sheet. We think there could be some clarifying language. The last bullet on this slide, I think Catherine's already hit on, so I'm going to skip it for time's sake. Can we go to the next slide? Thank you. So Design Storm Casca supports and has confirmed that the Design Storm criteria incorporated in this draft permit is consistent with other statewide general permits, including the Phase 2 MS4 general permit and other statewide guidance, including that developed by Casca, with some minor modifications. We are going to provide some suggested revisions there. We'd like to see the Design Storm criteria actually be modified slightly to be required only when facilities are pushed into this ERA Level 2 process and required to have treatment controls. Dischargers who have not exceeded an NAL or been pushed or triggered into the process shouldn't be held to these Design Storm standards if it's voluntary. Next slide. Instantaneous numeric action levels. The current draft triggers the ERA process if there are 2 instantaneous NAL exceedances during a reporting year for any facility outfall, even if there's 8 to 10 outfalls at a facility. The current fact sheet actually states that these instantaneous NALs are meant to target hotspots and drainage areas with recurring high-value exceedances. If we're really trying to target hotspots and drainage areas, and if that's the goal of these instantaneous NALs, the ERA trigger really should be based on multiple exceedances from the same outfall and not multiple outfalls potentially months apart at a facility. Next slide. Monitoring and analysis. This is from our comment package in 2012. We're bringing it forward. But the method detection limits for several of the parameters identified in Table 2 of the permit are actually orders of magnitude lower than the numeric action levels that have been set. And many are actually lower than what can be achieved by state certified laboratories, and we've talked to several through the state. These unnecessarily low method detection limits for routinely detected parameters specifically will increase analytical costs and limit the laboratories that are available to do this work. We recommend revising the draft permit to state the analytical method used shall be capable of achieving a minimum level that is below that numeric action level that's been set. We also recommend the use of geometric mean rather than arithmetic mean for determination of the annual average when comparing to the numeric action levels. As we're all aware, storm events and stormwater quality runoff is highly variable. And the arithmetic mean can really be distorted by one single atypical event and may not be representative of the average or typical discharge quality for an industrial site.
Before you move on, can I ask a question?
Sure.
Greg, can you or someone else respond to that, help us understand?
The geometric mean versus the annual average?
No, I mean, that would be fine, but just going back to where the MDLs are set and whether they're capable of being tested, that whole issue.
Well, a lot of the language in the permit draft requirements regarding monitoring and analysis are driven by MPDS regulations. And so when we require, there's actually a bit of a controversy internally about the pH meter versus the pH paper. That was a great example of that. But the regs say use EPA approved methods. Along with that, you're bringing in the interest from EPA to have quality assurance, quality control data that's consistent so that you could start comparing states to states and what have you. And so a lot of that just carries through. I don't know how much flexibility we have legally to go above the method detection limits, but we can look into that if they make the comment.
Great.
You want to talk about the geometric mean too? Is that the same? Greg, the geometric mean, is the geometric mean a part of that, or is that a different?
We looked at ways to analyze data, both on the setting, how you would look at data in our database to set levels, like action levels, as well as how the discharger could use different statistical methods to compare to those levels. We've arrived at what we recommend, which is the annual average. There are pros and cons to everything. It is true that this is not a normally distributed kind of a population of data, but it's also true that we have a very low N value, so to speak, from a statistical perspective. So we're not really doing true good statistical approaches here. So I think we're kind of in the weeds on this geometric mean versus annual average. Staff has looked into it, but if they make the comment, then we'll consider it one more time.
Yeah, and I think a couple of these last comments, it'll be helpful to see the response to comments from the last draft, just so we understand what staff's thinking. Last two slides. CASCA urges the State Board to evaluate opportunities to incorporate LID and green infrastructure incentives into this next version of our permit. While these types of BMPs may not always be appropriate, there should be some recognition associated with the volume and load reduction that these type of BMPs bring. Simply evaluating based on a discharge concentration really overlooks and potentially discourages industrial dischargers from looking at LID alternatives.
Why? Why is that? Just because if you're doing LID, you're going to capture stuff. So why would it be different from other BMPs you're going to try?
I think generally that you're capturing that water, and let's say you're infiltrating, you're reducing your discharge volume. Once you actually do discharge, you're not getting any benefit for all that pollutant mass you've removed. You're basically held to a point in time discharge concentration once you actually start discharging, even though you may have reduced 90% of the volume of pollutants from your site. Does that make sense?
So are you saying that if you do LID because LID is good, you should be allowed to pass on what actually goes off the site?
Not necessarily a
or
pass,
more time, or
not
what are you?
necessarily a pass, but maybe looking at some alternative way to look at these LID type BMPs, and not just as a straight concentration, but get some credit maybe for the reduction in mass. I mean, it's a different way to look at it for sure, and I know there's others who may be commenting on this. And we can certainly explore that further in our comments. Okay, 2 minutes left. So while this draft is a major improvement over the previous drafts, it is still significantly more complex than our existing, again, this 1997 permit, significantly more complex, and will require an extensive investment in time, effort, and capital from industrial dischargers all over the state. So we're not just comparing it to the last draft, we're comparing it to where we're sitting right now. And we really urge the State Board and staff to be proactive with the outreach and guidance provided to dischargers. I think it's going to be really important, and CASCA looks forward to assisting as needed with that process. So we'd like to quickly close by saying thank you for the opportunity to present this morning, and we will be submitting a package, and we'll make it as useful as possible with showing language revisions as appropriate, but we'll open up to questions. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Any questions before we move to the next panel? Thank you. Very clear. Thank you. Helpful presentation. Next, we'll move to the environmental panel. And yeah, it's only 10, so we're not going to take a break. When this panel finishes, we'll take a short break since we have quite a few speakers, but not something that will take us all day. So I will be a kinder chair, and you can have a 15-minute bio break, coffee break, whatever you like. Outdoor photosynthesis break, whatever works for you.
You can practice the emergency evacuation.
You could practice the emergency evacuation procedure. That would be an excellent idea.
Thank you, Chair Marcus. I'm Mike Lozo, the first of 3 on the environmental interest panel. But I'm sure everyone in the room has environmental interests in mind. I wanted to focus in on one key thing, not 9, one key issue that I have and CESPA has, as well as the other groups. And then if I have time, I'll try and touch on some, perhaps less priority concerns, little more specific changes that we're going to put into our written comments as well. And for the record, it's Mike Lozo from Lozo Jury in Oakland, California. I wanted to talk about the best available technology, best conventional technology, BAT, BCT changes in the permit, or language changes where it's been replaced with a BIP kind of notion, best industry practice. And this is where Catherine, Ms. Wagner, indicated she was extremely happy. And whenever Catherine's happiness index goes up, my index.
Oh, the world is way more complex.
I don't know if I'm
today.
extremely unhappy, though, actually, so it might not be quite as off the mark there. The permit does start out with 2 findings that we're quite comfortable with and I think are consistent with law, which is in finding 1 and 32, it basically says that people have to implement BAT, BCT. we're all well and good there. Once we get into the actual effluent limitations, though, reference to BAT, BCT basically disappears. And that's a change from the previous draft. It's a change from the existing permit, which the existing permit actually has kind of a long-winded version of it. The previous draft had a very concise version of it, which is, you know, facilities have to implement BAT, BCT. So whatever these other terms are, best industry practices, this or that, the core of it is you got to have BAT and BCT in place, whether it goes in place on level 1, level 2, whenever. In the end, you got to have BAT, BCT in place. And we're still in that same realm where the board hasn't gone through a process to actually technically figure out what that might be. So it's kind of left to each individual site. So you can't have it both ways. You can't be thinking that you're designating or looking like you're designated, which is what we heard Ms. Wagner say, that you're sort of designating a narrative standard for BAT when you haven't actually gone through a BAT, BCT analysis. We made a lot of comments about how, you know, you could. We think you have the data to do that, but the current position is the state board hasn't. So when you get into the effluent limits, and it's section 5A, page 20 of the current draft, you end up with this BIP standard. It's repeated in various sections in the effluent limit part of the permit. Section XH1, XH2 has this reference, and it never says BAT, it says best industry practices. We're concerned that it's going to be interpreted to be something other than BAT or some other standard than your glossary defines BAT and BCT as. The glossary has an accurate definition of what BAT and BCT is. It's not the same language as that you see in the effluent limitation section 5A, which replaces it. And I think staff's intent was it's basically the same, but that's not how people in the real world will end up interpreting it when they're confronted with either a regional board action or, you know, when they're trying to make a decision and they have a tough cost decision to make. It's not how they're going to view that provision. They're going to find some interpretation that is something less than what, you know, someone might think is BAT or BCT. Even in the reports for level 2 and level 1, everything is aimed at the NALs, and all the references to BAT and BCT came out. We were concerned about the process in the last draft where, you know, there'd be a BAT report and it would go to the staff, and staff would just decide, you know, is that, you know, approve that report or something like that. We didn't like that because we felt that was too substantive in terms of a term of the permit that wasn't a public process like this to decide whether to change the permit. But we weren't opposed to having a report of each facility saying this is what I think BAT and BCT is for my facility. Suddenly, now all the reports are aimed at just NALs, and it makes the permit very lopsided. So when you're below NALs, you know, you basically, the permit kind of goes away in effect. But if you're above them, you know, there's all this language, oh, the NALs don't mean anything, or all that important, you know, there's guides, blah, blah, blah. So it's very lopsided, and you have nothing that actually says in those reports, this is BAT, BCT for our facility. You have something that's just shooting for the NALs, which, you know, may or may not be BATs. A technology-based requirement does not necessarily turn on water quality alone. In fact, it's not really part of the equation. It's what's the technology that's out there. So that also is infused with this absence of comply with BAT, BCT, or what might be interpreted as that, because I'm not sure that's what staff had in mind.
Can, before you move on to the next point, I'd love to give staff a chance to clarify what they had in mind.
Sure, so I'll pause before I move to the next point.
Yeah,
How about that?
perfect.
I mentioned the glossary. I mentioned the fact that the permits, you know, this is new, because the last draft and the existing draft clearly say people have to implement BAT, BCT. There's no